I forgot I have a prop. So good morning again, everybody.
Good morning.
I'd like to begin this morning by inviting you to think about a pending choice that you have to make in your life. Particularly, I prefer if it's something that's nagging you, maybe a nagging choice. Anyone got one of those? So, before we go any further, I want to share a quote from the great Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh that somebody gave us on an altar in the office. And Eeyore says, "Never underestimate the value of doing nothing." Pretty good, right? Sometimes we look down at the Eeyores of life, those that seem to be moving a little slower, those who express a lot of patience, those who don't seem in a hurry to try to control things. They just let things be. But the truth is there's a lot of wisdom in the Eeyores out there in the world, isn't there? Do we have any Eeyores here today with us? Yes. And it's interesting to think that sometimes in terms of choices that we need to make, that we may undervalue how wise doing nothing could become. Because it's sometimes when we step back that we allow things to become, when we don't meddle, when we don't control, when we bring a presence of trust, things can create in quite a profound way. All that being said, when it comes to the choice that you are being called to make, how many of you already know what that choice is? So quite a few of you. I love a scene in the TV show Boardwalk Empire on HBO. Did anyone here watch that show? It's about the rise of mobsters in America during Prohibition in the 1920s, and in a particular scene, Nookie Thompson is talking with Arnold Rothstein about a tough decision that he has to make. And Rothstein says to him, "Throw a coin up in the air, and when it's in the air, you'll know which side you hope it will land on." Isn't that true for a lot of us? We're often looking to life outside of us to confirm the choice that we already know we're going to make. And it tells us something interesting about this thing called choice, that often what we're looking for when we've yet to choose isn't so much wisdom, but courage and conviction to make the choice that we already know that we want to make. And I would share the Boardwalk Empire quote a little bit more often, but the choice is about whacking somebody, and so it doesn't work if you've seen the show. It does speak a little bit to the power of choice, because to me the most pragmatic aspect of living a spiritual life, living a life with mindfulness, is that recognition that we are at choice, that we are choosing beings. And if we use our choices wisely, we can co-create our lives with God. Viktor Frankl, the great psychologist, famously said, "Between stimulus and response, get no men from the street." Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. It teaches us that perhaps the way to be spiritual isn't to throw ourselves to some higher power, which is just fine, but it's to stop reacting to everything that happens in our life. Stop being mechanized by everything going on around us and have that conscious moment. Give ourselves that space to choose. And when we do that, we unlock our ability to live a spiritual and creative life. I have a friend of mine who was recently telling me the story of something a coworker did that wasn't right. The coworker was speaking to a client and said something that was against the company and self-serving to what they wanted. And my friend was trying to decide how he wanted to respond to this particular situation. Did he want to feel hurt and express betrayal to this person and anger towards him? Did he want to express a kind of a fear and being put down and maybe just act it out in a passive-aggressive way but not say anything? And my friend told me that ultimately what he decided to do was to recognize that what the coworker did had nothing to do with him, but with himself, and that what he was going to do was to listen to this person and to be compassionate, to be caring, to listen. And I thought that was very powerful. Even though it's very simple, it's very powerful as well, to be able to choose how we're going to respond to something. It's not always easy, but I've certainly learned in my life that even if I have to do something that's negative, maybe it's let someone go, or maybe it's to share with someone that I'm angry or hurting, if I am able to do so in a way that's caring and compassionate, I know that's not only the most spiritual way to go about it, but it almost always leads to the best result possible. It reminds me of something in the Tao Te Ching, which tells us, there is no greater illusion than fear, no greater wrong than preparing to defend yourself, no greater misfortune than having an enemy. When we really are able to take a breath in that moment between stimulus and response, we can enter in with a consciousness that was a little bit more like Eeyore was talking about. Not reacting with a sense of forcefulness or control, but in tuning back into our greater spirit, our deeper nature. Now, if we can go back to that choice that you have to make, how many of you know that the choice that you have to make involves a direct action, something that you have to do? Maybe it's say yes or say no, maybe it's go left or go right. Most choices do demand that we do something directly, and we human beings are very good human doers, right? We're always acting. How many of us, however, are not choosing right now? And it's an interesting thing when we're in this place that I'll just call inaction, because perhaps one of the greatest human illusions that we can fall into is this idea that we are not at choice, or that we don't have to choose. We forget that not choosing itself is a choice that has its own set of consequences. I know in my own life that the worst things that I have done aren't so much actions, but they're inactions. There are moments when I didn't speak up for myself or for somebody else around me. There are things I didn't go through with that would have been better for me because of fear, or because of distrust, or because of doubt. It's very easy to choose inaction. And the consequences can be severe. When you don't ask the guy out and somebody else does. When you don't look for the better job and someone else looks and then gets it. When you don't go through with something that feeds and calls your passion. No one else may seem to notice, but our heart remembers these things, doesn't it? There is another way, however, of not acting. And I'm calling it today non-action. So when we have a choice in front of us, there's often the doing that's being called for, but sometimes we respond with inaction. We choose not doing anything. But there's another way, and that's a spiritual way. It's the way of non-action. It's what Eeyore was talking about. Where inaction is a response out of fear or doubt or mistrust, non-action can be a choice that we make out of faith, out of confidence, out of trust. This is what my friend did when he decided not to do something with a coworker, but to be something in relationship with him. He didn't know what action he was going to be called to take, but he was going to listen. He knew he was going to be passionate. A month or so ago, I shared a writing from one of our congregants that said that she was going to try to stop getting in all of her kids' business. Because that's how she was seeking to love them, and that's how she was seeking to try and get love from her kids, was by trying to solve their problems for them. And she realized that she could try a different way, a way that was about taking a deep breath and just listening to them, just loving them, just supporting them, just trusting them to have the tools themselves to solve their problems without needing to do it for them. And so it created significant and powerful results. The book of the month and the book that inspires the talks this month is the Tao Te Ching, which is an ancient book of Chinese wisdom, and it's attributed to a gentleman named Lao Tzu, who we don't really know if he existed or not, but he collects all of this great wisdom from the time. And he says, I have just 3 things to teach: simplicity, patience, compassion. Doesn't sound nice for all of us? Simplicity, patience, compassion. These 3 are your greatest treasures. Simple in actions and in thoughts, you return to the source of being. Patient with both friends and enemies, you accord with the way things are. Compassionate toward yourself, you reconcile all beings in the world. Tao is a word that we can translate in a lot of different ways. We can translate it to mean the way. We can translate it to mean God. We can translate it to mean spirit. One way that I like to interpret it is as nature, as in like capital N, nature, the nature of things. And Tao teaches things almost opposite than how we kind of grew up learning them in our culture. We are told that Tao nourishes without forcing. We are told yielding is the way of the Tao. For some people looking at the teachings of the Tao, they say, this is nonsense. It's like a kid playing opposite. When he says yes, he means no, and when he says no, he means yes. But when you look deeper, when you look more deeply at the idea, what Lao Tzu is talking about is nature. That everything has a nature. That there's a nature to spirit, that there's a nature to the psychology of each of us, that there's a nature to matter and to the way things work around us. And by observing nature, Lao Tzu realized that nature doesn't get pissed off. Nature doesn't try to control things. Nature doesn't have a to-do list. Nature isn't forcing things to happen. Nature is patient. Nature, by being soft and not rushing, can transform or change anything. Nature, just by being itself, can bring about life itself. And so Lao Tzu realizes that we human beings, we have a nature too, but because of this thing called choice, this ability to have a say between stimulus and response, we can live outside of accord with our own nature. We can start to do this controlling stuff. We can start to do this fixing everything stuff. But if we can take a deep breath and move into that way of non-action, we can resume our true nature, which can help us live in a greater way. The teacher says, he who stands on tiptoe doesn't stand firm. He who rushes ahead doesn't go far. He who tries to shine dims his own light. He who defines himself can't know who he really is. He who has power over others can't empower himself. He who clings to his work will create nothing that endures. If you want to accord with the Tao, just do your job, then let go. I like the directness of that statement. Just do your job and let go. Or in a more spiritual sense, just be you and let go. Going back to that choice that you have to make again, and I would probably be willing to bet on this. There's that thing that you're called to do in a situation, but I also invite you to ask yourself, what am I called to become in this situation? Who am I called to be? And I would be willing to bet that who you are called to be would have a greater influence on a positive result than even what you're called to do. And when we can step back in our situations and realize that it's not so much a part of the doing is important, yes, but who we are choosing to be that really influences our affairs in a greater way. It doesn't always change the people around us or get them to do what we want them to do, but it allows us to get to what we generally want anyways, which is a way of being in our own virtues, being in what we value. The other thing that non-action can really assist us with is it can allow us to start resuming being a part of our true being as opposed to being identified with just our to-do list. How many of ourselves have learned to really live based upon a task list? We're just trying to get things done because we think that will hold the world up somehow. And if we don't fulfill every item on that checklist, we begin to think that the world is going to fall apart. It becomes who we are, so much so that the things that are most important to us become neglected. We don't act, we practice inaction in our love life. We practice inaction in our spiritual life. We practice inaction in all sorts of those important areas that we say are so important, but we begin to feel unfulfilled and we don't know why, so we better add another to-do and start living that way. Non-action says stop doing all the things that we think are so important and focus on those few things that matter most. Because when we're in a place of non-action, when we do have to do, we do it right. We do it with intentionality. We do it with caring. One of my favorite Taoists, I don't think he knew he was a Taoist, is Abraham Lincoln. Probably the most well-respected and admired president that we've ever had. And President Lincoln was someone, to me, who was a great master of non-action because he knew he had so much on his plate, so many big things to do in terms of Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, so much that was going on in the country that if he concerned himself with all the to-dos, he would never help lead our country to where he was able to help lead it to before it got handed off on that journey of where we still are, trying to fulfill and embody our great American ideals. But Lincoln was a master of saying no. And he had this great ability, too, whenever I read stories about him. He seems to be so polite when he says no. He's very diplomatic. And there's a particular story about Lincoln where he's called forth by a group of Midwestern senators. And he sits down in the middle and he's surrounded by them, and they all go through a list of all the things that they think he ought to be doing, all the stuff that he's not doing. And Lincoln very respectfully listens to what each of them has to say, and when they're all complete, he looks at them and he says, "I'm not going to do a single thing any of you have asked." He says it with a smile, and he in a very caring and respectful way, goes over what each person said and why he's not going to do it. And he closes by telling them a little anecdote about a family of farmers who are always moving all the time. And they're moving so often that they're down to one wagon. There's less and less of them as they're more and more scattered in all of this doing and moving around. And they move so often that whenever the chickens see the wagon sheets go up, they lay down and cross their legs, ready to be tied. Now, Lincoln said, if I were to be guided by every committee that comes in that door, I might just as well cross my hands and let you tie me. Nevertheless, I am glad to see you. Well, how many of us are like those chickens? Where somebody starts to panic, there seems to be a problem out there, and we lay right down, and we cross our legs, we cross our arms, and we let someone or something else decide what our actions are going to be. We give into that. But there's something to be said, of course, especially if we want to fulfill those things we're most passionate about in our lives, that we must remain untied, that we can remain kind to people around us and respectful, but we have to focus in on that which matters most to us. Non-action also helps me not to be a jerk. Many of you probably have something like I do, a 24-hour rule. That means if someone says something that bugs me or offends me or hurts my feelings, I try to wait 24 hours before I talk to them about it. Sometimes the hurt's still there, the anger's still there, and that's on me to do something about it and talk to them. But often I'm able to say, you know what they said wasn't about me, it was about them. Or maybe they misspoke. And it doesn't mean I don't do anything. What I do is I pray for them. I pray for me. I forgive. I do these things that take me back to a way of being as opposed to a way of doing or fixing or controlling, or that responds to the limited vibration, we might say, of that situation. There's something so powerful about re-anchoring ourselves in that greater truth of our being. The Tao Te Ching tells us the master does his job and then stops. He understands that the universe is forever out of control, and that trying to dominate events goes against the current of the Tao. Because he believes in himself, he doesn't try to convince others. Because he is content with himself, he doesn't need others' approval. Because he accepts himself, the whole world accepts him. Two of my favorite phrases from Abraham Lincoln came in one paragraph. They came in the last paragraph of his first inaugural address, and there are two things that speak to the power of non-action in the very heart of what I'm trying to share today. He was speaking to a country on the brink of war and already in great strife. He says, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." Lincoln would be famous for saying the best way to get rid of an enemy is to make them my friend. Though passion may have strained it, must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, that's the first phrase, the mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot, brave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Both of those are quite powerful phrases to me. The mystic chords of memory and the better angels of our nature. What is he saying there? Remember the truth of who we really are. And that's all we are really called to do when faced with a challenging choice. Maybe there is something to do, but more importantly, there is someone to be. Remember those mystical chords. Turn to those angels of your better nature. And if you can listen to them and respond to them in your doing or in your non-doing, you can trust that they will show up and demonstrate for you. So thank you for your time, everyone, this morning. Thanks for coming. Thanks for